Yeah, thank you for spending some time this afternoon on this recommended changes in the property tax exemption policy that the city has. As I go through this, feel free to pause at any time, and then also as we get into the different types of policies, I'll probably pause and ask you for some input to see if you think we're on the right track, because this is an overall tax exemption policy. There's sort of 8 different sub-policies, and they're each trying to achieve different goals. And so really like your thoughts on if you're comfortable with where we are at each section of that policy. The overall mission statement of the policy is really to support economic and community development through the use of available tax incentive programs. And the goals, I think, fit with our various plans that we've adopted in the past. And so those things include first, creating high-quality jobs by attracting new and expanding primary sector businesses that can help grow our economy and provide better jobs for people in our community. Also, to promote historic preservation and development in the downtown district. Again, these are plans that we've had for the last 20 years, and these are policies aimed at implementing those broader plans. To support the housing market as well as affordable housing, making sure we have the type of housing we need in the community, and supporting a wide variety of housing development in the community. Support and encourage a redevelopment of brownfield sites. This fits with a lot of our infill strategy to make use of existing infrastructure and encourage redevelopment of sites that might have contamination or other barriers or extra costs to develop. The more we can use existing properties, limits the amount of expansion that we have to do on the edge of the community. To support the redevelopment of blighted properties in the core neighborhoods, similar to the brownfield, we want to make use of those sites, but it's especially important in older neighborhoods, because if you have blighted properties, that can be a deterrent for other people to fix up their properties or want to live in that particular neighborhood. And then also finally, to grow the city's tax base, enhance the city's livability, vibrancy, and quality of life by having better neighborhoods, and also that tax base expanding, because more people that are paying property taxes in the same footprint, the less everyone else has to pay. This policy then would be effective at least until the June 2022 election, just to kind of give developers an idea that, what the policy will be at least for the next 6 months. Following an election, we can review the policy and see how it's going. We don't have to review it exactly in July, as the case here. We've kind of waited about a year before we got around to getting close to completion of the policy. I think the overall format reads a lot better than the other policy. The other policy was sort of 8 different policies kind of mashed into one, and I think this gives a broader overview and hopefully reads better for people who are considering development and you as policymakers to see what fits and qualifies for the incentives and what does not. The available options in this particular policy are ones that are allowed by the North Dakota Century Code. That includes the residential new housing exemption, the remodeling exemption, new and expanding business exemption and pilot, where we can have lower property taxes on a whole wide range of activities, kind of whatever the city feels is appropriate as long as it's an enterprise, and then also tax increment financing. It's important to note that there are 2 other incentives that we use for community and economic development. That includes the Renaissance Zone that's administered by the Renaissance Zone Authority in the Planning Department, and the community development incentives are various HUD money that we receive. Many times you've seen where we've used multiple programs on the same particular project, especially low-income housing. This isn't a summary. It says the data is current. It actually is not. We're still working on the table. This is from about a year and a half ago, but just gives you the idea of how much property is tax exempt in these different types of categories, whether it's low-income housing, remodeling, the downtown projects, public-private partnerships. This represents about 2.3% of our property tax base. We have the total more recently, but it's higher, but it's still at roughly 2.3% of the property taxes that property tax base of the community.
Jim, could I have you, I'm sorry, go back just 2 slides, or back one more, please, to the statutes, or your mention of statutes. While you're on that topic, so I know, when these 4 categories that are statutorily laid out, which ones, or to what degree can we modify any of those within allowance of the statutes?
Yeah, within the statutes, you can do less than the maximum, but you can't do more.
Can't do more, okay?
Yeah. So I'll probably note as I go through here where we're doing the most that's allowed and where we're doing maybe our policy is somewhat less than what's allowed by the law.
Great, because there's some topics I'm interested in, but then I find out we can't do it.
Yeah.
So if you help me know that, that's good information for me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Then this is just a pie chart that shows, how much that benefit goes to businesses, property owners, the city, or renters. This is an example of closed tax increment financing districts. So it shows how when we've done these TIF projects that we had a pre-value of 9 million. There was an increase in value up to 392 million. I did start to update this chart, and I think it's over 400 million now. But for these TIF districts that are closed, because the property values continue to go up. Some of them they're hard to calculate because they're relatively large areas, and we don't have. It's a lot of parcels to try to add up and figure out where we're at today. So in that case, the increase in value is sort of the last year that we actually kept track of that district. I've tried to get some comments from each of you on that last draft policy. Mayor Mahoney and Deputy Mayor Pepcorn were on the committee, and so they've already provided a lot of input into that first draft and didn't have that many other suggestions other than, suggesting we really do a good job with monitoring, reporting, and any kind of clawback provisions that we have. And I'll kind of, as we go through these policies, touch on how we try to address some of the policies. Because everyone wanted to make sure we do good on monitoring. Commissioner Strand suggested we look at trying to figure out if we can include a requirement for a living wage. Wanted to look at inclusionary housing in both the core neighborhoods and the downtown. And then another comment was to manage extraterritorial expansion and ensure that new growth is self-funded, and mentioned the public art. Arlette, you had mentioned trying to do some limits on the new housing exemption for builders, because right now the new housing exemption, it could actually be up to 4 years because the builder could take 2 and then the first-time buyer could take 2. Similar to Commissioner Strand, look at the safety records and low wages. Maybe there should be a deal, kind of some real minimums there. Trying to define affordable housing. I think that's something we need to do with our housing study, and then also to define brownfields. Commissioner Garrig, you had suggested, that we'd eliminate a lot of these, but also we're specific, and that you agreed with Commissioner Preston about the ending the new housing exemption or cutting that back. So let's go first. Again, we'll maybe try to stop on each one of these and see if there's concern, but the new residential housing exemption policy. And so what we're doing is the maximum that's allowed by state law. You can limit, you can exempt up to $150,000 of value for 2 years. That can be for the builder, so the builder could have an exemption for 2 years, and then the first-time buyer can also have an exemption for 2 years. the committee isn't suggesting any changes to this policy. The home builders felt that this was quite important. As far as the impact of the builder exemption, I think the city assessor told me there's about 20 houses on average a year that receive the exemption. Most of the houses for builders, they sell the home relatively quick, and they're not really holding a lot of houses in inventory. So just want to see if you want to have any discussion on this. There's 79 million in exemption. There's actually there's probably even more than that the houses pay because you're limited to that 150, and many of the homes are worth double that. So I want to get any thoughts or discussion on this first item.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just say something here. I think this one needs to be examined in light of the core neighborhood study that we just finished, the plan that we're trying to move forward with. So, I'm okay with it staying as it is for now, but when we get the ROI study back, I really think that this piece needs to be reevaluated. Again, we're just chasing our tail if we're trying to put money into rehabbing homes when their market value is being impacted negatively by incenting growth on the greenfield. So,
Any other?
Yeah, and the same sort of thought. We're incentivizing everything, so we're really incentivizing anything. So, like you said, we put money in the core neighborhood, we put money in the Renaissance zone, and we're putting money in the greenfield for the new buildings. So really, in my mind, if we're incentivizing everything that we're doing already, if we took away all the incentives, it'd be the same thing, only whatever was more popular would just happen. So I think we're paying a lot of money to do exactly what we would be doing if we did none of those things. So we've studied this for a long time. We've been doing this for decades, for a really long time. I think it's time to end it. The housing market is booming plenty, and we're really just giving an incentive to the builders to expand further and faster.
Mr. Strand.
Thank you. I would go the other direction. I wish we could have the state allow us to expand this as far as we could. From my perspective, in the last 30 years, we've gone from the bulk of our people living in houses, their own homes, to apartments. Well, that's because we incented it. And if we don't incent home ownership adequately, we're going to see that trend continue to go the wrong direction. I'm all about home ownership. I think that that's the best value we could look for, is people investing in homes and owning their own homes. And for years, 2 years is nothing. 2 years isn't even a stamp drawer change. So from my perspective, I'd like to see us advocate and lobby the state to enhance this so we can incent more home ownership. That's what we really, truly need, home ownership.
Mr. Pepcorn.
So, Mr. Chair, I do agree with what Commissioner Strand said. I do think we have to be careful because we have competition. And I do think if we decided to unilaterally do that, it would have a negative impact on our city. But I do think what I would like to see is we have such good incentives for new homes, but really the existing homes are where our low cost housing is. And to figure out a program where we could have even more for that is what I would really like to see, if there was a way to do that. I don't know if that makes sense, but more of an incentive for the existing home stock, because that's where entry-level homes are, I believe. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Preston.
yeah, I would echo that. Starter homes are not necessarily the new homes. And you have to qualify for the loan no matter what that 2-year exemption is. And so it's an issue of income level matching the pricing of new homes. And there's a mismatch there. So instead, we should be putting our incentives and our focus on the true starter homes, which probably are the used homes, if we can try to save some of them from going into rental housing and or anything else. So I agree, home ownership is an issue, but incenting with 2-year property tax exemption is not going to get us there.
So the one thing that happened this year is Horace is up to 250 homes. I think West Fargo is 220, and I think we're about 230. So if we drop it, we have to remember we're in competition with Horace and West Fargo. I agree that we should look at somehow how to incentivize people to go into the older neighborhoods. So maybe we need to add an additional program to help that out, because that's what our grant land does, where we try to do, we own the land and the people own the house. So I think we will continue to explore ways of maybe helping the first home buyer. What are some ways we can help them out? Mr. Pepper?
Just one more real quick, and I apologize, Mr. Chair. But so what the current policy is a 2-year tax exemption for newly constructed residential homes. How about we just say, strike newly constructed and say residential dwellings? Think of the impact that would have. Because a lot of the existing homes are not as expensive. And so anyway, I'm just throwing that out there, but I think something like that, that should be our charge, is to try to figure out how to improve that, because that's where the starter homes are in our existing. Thank you.
Mr. Gehrig?
I think the disconnect we're all going to find here today with these exemptions is we have different ideas of what's going to work. I think we all have the same goal: more home ownership, less apartments, more growth. The one way to have less apartments would be to stop incentivizing apartments, not to incentivize homeowners more. Because what we're doing now is we're giving incentives to offset the incentives that we've already given for the incentives over here, right? We want another incentive for the existing homes so we can offset the incentive that we're giving for the new homes. That's insanity. That's nuts. The government shouldn't be incentivizing things against the incentives they're giving to somebody else to incentivize other things. How about we just knock it off? Stop doing it. That will lower the cost of things. Because right now, we're kind of competing against ourselves, and we're making things more expensive. If we let the free market work, we will see faster growth. Believe it or not, if the government just stops doing some of these things, we'll get what we want, just because that's what the people want. They want to own homes. They want to be able to afford homes. They don't want to live in apartments. So let's stop incentivizing apartments. That's step one that we should be doing for all these.
Jim, that's only for new homes. This is state law, so we can't change it to new old homes.
Yeah, this is state law. We had looked at the last legislative session. There was a bill to try to help older neighborhoods, and that ended up failing. Sort of a neighborhood similar to the Renaissance Zone, something for older neighborhoods. And again, that bill was didn't pass. Just one other idea. I think we do need to look at other policies beyond these tax exemption. For instance, in the older neighborhoods now, if you're building a replacement home, we have a requirement in Fargo for a flood-proof foundation and to build up to a certain elevation. And while that was implemented before the diversion was approved and probably made a lot of sense then, the question is, do we still want to require flood-proof foundations in older neighborhoods when the diversion might be 6 years away? That might save more than this tax exemption. And I know engineering is looking at that, so just keep that in mind also.
And to the point is, that is something we could do. We've talked about this, is when do you start changing some of your building codes because the diversion's coming. So those are some things we could actually look into. If the older home, you went into it and didn't have to put a flood-proof basement and or Lomar it, you would save $20,000 on the house. So, Commissioner Preston.
If I could ask one more question in regards to that. So the flood proofing is not related to flood insurance. It is an internal policy?
Yes, we go above and beyond the FEMA requirements. You need a flood-proof foundation if you're at a certain elevation, where I believe our requirement is citywide. And so that's not required in Horace, but it is required in
So we could drop that anytime?
I believe so. I would want
We've
to
got
get some,
plenty of flood control projects in place. It seems like it might be wise, before the diversion is even finished, that we do that.
I think that certainly needs, and I know that's under review in engineering, but I just wanted to mention it because it's another thing that.
We could have Nathan review that and bring it to us, Commissioner Preston, so that'd be a good idea. Yeah.
Okay. Next, we'll move on to this remodeling policy. This is a policy that allows buildings that are remodeled to stay at the same value that they were prior to the remodeling. Like 20 years ago, it was at 3 years, and actually it was Fargo that went to the legislature and said, let's make that 5 years, because we're incenting new homes. Let's also incent you give some benefit to people that are fixing up their old homes. We're not everything that used to qualify would still qualify. there'd be two major expansions. One is buildings 25 to 40 years old could now get a 5-year exemption, not just a 3-year exemption. State law allows that, and we had limited it to 3 years for buildings in that 25 to 40 category. Also, the state law allows any building additions to qualify, and again, the city had restricted that to just the downtown, and the committee is suggesting that go throughout the city because there are other areas where you might be able to do some infill, encourage business to add on at their current location rather than going and building new at another location. So the only footnote on that is that building additions larger than the existing buildings would still require some review by tax exempt before it would go to city commission, so that if someone was adding on 500 or 200 units to a 20-unit apartment building, we'd look closer at that one to see if it was really justified.
Commissioner Strand.
Jim, this might be an interesting, and maybe it's surfaced in other areas of discussion, but the topic of accessory dwelling units, mother-in-law houses and suites, the ability to have another little space for family members to live in. So we increase the density on existing lots of property in the inner city, and so on. Is there any way that we address that or could address it in this topic or anywhere? And I'm not sure how that intermeshes with the new core neighborhood plans, whether they have allowed or want accessory dwelling units?
Yeah, I mean, I think if there was an accessory dwelling unit that could qualify for that 2-year exemption, this is one where I think the law is specific that it needs to be attached. So if you build an attached garage, it would qualify. If you built a detached garage, I don't believe it would qualify. So for that remodeling exemption. So again, this new policy, we're doing sort of everything that state law would allow versus something a little bit less, which is what we currently have. And these have been probably approved every meeting without much discussion, so I'll just assume you're comfortable with this. So. Now we'll move into the new and expanding business exemption pilot policy. This pilot law allows cities to grant really any business enterprise up to a 20-year property tax exemption for any sort of revenue generating business, whether that's primary sector, non-primary sector, or an apartment building. So the law is very broad in what you can do, and so in most cases, the city is doing something less than that. So the job creation one, this we spent quite a bit of time on. There have been 22 of these projects in the last 5 years. So you see 4 to 5 of these a year. The unchanged aspects of the policy are that generally it's going to be the 5-year exemption is standard. Most of these you see are 5-year. There's a 10 years we've granted for extraordinary projects that have more jobs or more capital investment. We try to define that within this new policy because it wasn't real clear before, so it provides a little bit of guidance. And then would provide incentives to primary sector businesses that create jobs. Some of the changes are that the incentive is now exclusive to primary sector. The language in the previous policy was typically, and so there were a few times I think that the exemption was granted to non-primary sector businesses. This clearly defines that and then kind of gives guidance to businesses that you shouldn't even bother to apply if you're not a primary sector business. There's a new scoring system. That scoring system looks at the safety record within the scoring. There's also, it increased the wages in different categories so that you would probably, if you're providing less than $15 an hour, I believe you get negative points rather than viewed as a positive.
Jim, excuse me 1 second, sorry, but is that embedded into it $15, or is it a reference to a living wage?
It's the actual $15 in different categories. I think we should look at that. We did some research on living wages, and it's hard to find a good benchmark because we looked at the Fargo market. The EDC provided us with some information, and so if you're if you're a single person making $15 an hour, that's a living wage because you should be able to get by fine. If you have a dependent, it's certainly not a living wage because you have other costs for childcare and other things. And if you have a spouse, and so there's like 5 different living wages depending on the size of your household. And so it was hard to, embed that in the policy. And it wasn't really an official government designation. It was just some website we located where they tried to define that. So, I think the other thing that we've asked for in the new policy is that it's not only so much per hour, but it's what kind of benefit. So you should at least have either like health care or pension or an extra high wage if you don't have one of those other benefits. We look at not just the hourly wage, but what kind of benefits come with it. So.
Mr. Strand.
Jim, in the past, we've had some applications go through where, for example, the bulk of their employees' new jobs are at the threshold we want financially, but in some instances, I remember one of them, 60% of them were $13 an hour and up. So does this preclude somebody from getting an incentive if they're coming in with 60% of their new jobs are $13 an hour, or does this just give a guidance that we hope you do, or where are the teeth? Where's the teeth in this?
The scoring system is certainly still a guide. You decide what to do, but for instance, for every job that's less than $15 an hour, you lose points, and for every one that's over 20, you gain points, and so your score is going to be based on kind of a weighted average, if you will, of how many are above. So if 90% of your jobs are over 25, but you have 4 people that are under 13 or at minimum, then you would still get quite a few points, although it would be discounted by the jobs that were a little bit lower. So.
And bear with me, but another option might be to just not even count under $15 an hour jobs.
Yeah, if they're under 15, they actually get negative points. So
But they still may get the incentive, though.
they might.
That's where I'm concerned, is that might not sway the ultimate decision.
Yeah.
So we could have points accumulated and accumulated and accumulated, and then we've awarded an incentive to somebody with a bunch of $13 an hour jobs. But I'm just theoretically. So maybe we look at that, but if we can tighten it up in any way to really create a lane for, we want $15 an hour jobs and up. I don't know how you do that, but.
Mr. Preston.
So, couple of comments. I'm wondering, and you might be covering this in a little bit, what weight that wage category question actually adds into the scoring criteria. If it's a minor portion of the scoring criteria, it's not going to mean much, to be honest with you. Secondly, okay, what was my second question? It'll come back.
Okay.
I'll pass it.
I'll try to get you some information on that. It's on page 9 of the policy. You can see all the criteria. I mean, if you're paying people over $35 an hour, at least some of the jobs, you're going to get a lot of points and would probably qualify. If almost all of your jobs are below 15, you're probably going to get negative points and would have a hard time reaching that minimum.
Just as a question, Jim, what's the most you can get for wage? Can you get 25 points or 20 points or 15 or
75.
75? So it does have a huge.
Pretty good
change,
weight.
but it does.
Mr. Chairman, I remembered my other. So instead of tying this to living wage, if that's difficult, why not just put in an automatic COLA every year?
I mean, that's something we could do to have it go up based on rate of inflation. We'd add that to the policy. I mean, I think what we're seeing in Fargo right now, it's really hard to find jobs that pay less than $15 an hour just with the market. But there's certainly some out there. But
Mr. Strand.
Thank you, Mayor. Jim, on that page 9 on the lower right-hand corner with hourly salaries and awarded points, what I would suggest we consider doing is start the negative points at the $13 to $15 an hour range and then accelerate it when it's under 13. I don't think, if somebody's creating jobs 13 to 15 and it's a zero base point system, that's not incenting anything. So maybe you just put negative points there.
Okay.
I want everything to put positive points for $15 and up and negative points for anything under 15.
Let me work with the EDC on that. I think that's a good point. I think the market has shifted such that that table should also shift even in the last 6 months.
Mr. Chair, just real quick, the bottom line is if you're offering $15 an hour right now, you're not going to hire any employees because the real wage right now is around $20 an hour starting. And so that's the competitive level. So I do agree that we should have this written in here, but in the market right now, that's $13 an hour. You're going to have 0 employees. That's the real world. Thank you.
Any other thoughts on this?
I think you got a lot of thoughts on it.
The lower income rental housing pilot, this has been a real important one because when the city assessor looks at an apartment building, they can't take into effect the fact that there's rent restrictions. And so if they have to pay property taxes at the same amount as other people, they'd be paying about $100 a month in property taxes for every apartment. And that doesn't make it feasible if you're trying to keep the rents low. The only change here is that we'd simply rely on the North Dakota Housing Finance Agency to review the applications. We've been sending these to our financial advisors, but it becomes so obvious that there's nowhere close to being able to be feasible if we charge the full property taxes. So the main change of the policy is to just not require that but-for test anymore. You'd still review them, but the Housing Finance Agency. It's important to provide these local incentives. That's a big part of the scoring system. And when you have programs where they're probably only going to be able to fund 1/3 of the applications that get submitted, the more we can help out these projects, the better.
Jim, bear with me, but there are 2 low-income housing tax credit programs, if I recall. One is like 9% and the other is 4%. Are these all lumped into one?
Yeah, they'd all be lumped into one, and the Housing Finance Agency would look at them, differently.
Okay.
The ones that are 4% generally have a little bit higher rents, for the 9% ones have more, quite low rents.
And that's competitive at the state level, so there's no
Yeah.
guarantee, and it's unlimited 4% application options?
Those are unlimited, or at least we never really hit our limits, but the 4% applications end up providing, I think, roughly 40% of the costs for a project. So that alone doesn't get it done, where the 9% ones end up providing more like 80% of the cost, and so that the capital cost. And so those are the ones that are competitive, and that's when you can provide the lowest rents. The core neighborhood housing pilot, this, right now, we have just had this policy in the University Mixed Use Zoning District. We were trying to encourage redevelopment to some older housing in that neighborhood. Revise this policy so that it's still in that area, but also we would look at other areas in the core neighborhood plan. There's been some interest in this program when you have an older apartment building or house that's converted. Primarily, it's have to be in a multifamily zoning district, but just northwest of the downtown, there are a lot of quite old buildings where some developers have looked at trying to clear the sites and bring in more modern housing. And so this would allow you to do that. I note here that we'd consider longer exemptions for affordable housing because typically we don't go beyond 10 years, but I think we need to complete that housing study, get an idea of what kind of rents we're trying to kind of achieve. Arlette, you noted that we need to define affordable housing, and I think that's really important to do in that housing study, so we identify what the gaps are. And John, you had suggested some inclusionary housing, and again, I think that's might be doable, but then you probably need to provide a greater incentive, and so we need to figure out that trade-off. All of these would be subjected to that but-for test to look at the financial return as they are now.
Jim, our new core neighborhood study also makes reference to suggesting that we include inclusionary housing in our incentive plan, but maybe they have some suggestions from other cities and what others have done in that. And, for example, if somebody builds a great big Block 9, they may not want to have 10% of their units to be affordable, of course. But those same owners, for example, maybe owned Woodrow Wilson, where they're developing another project and they could put their affordable units in another property in a similar vicinity. But that topic, I tell you what I don't understand here is what's changing. I don't know where we're gonna end up with this. I don't know, like, for example, or is there more coming? If we were to look at the Roosevelt neighborhood as an at-risk neighborhood, what will this do there? I don't know what we're changing.
I mean, this doesn't change what we're doing already. This would allow us to do housing projects in other neighborhoods other than the Roosevelt. And that was strictly the western side of the Roosevelt neighborhood in that university mixed use zone. So, I mean, it's going to be still very important. Well, what's the site like? I don't think we want to encourage someone to take down a bunch of owner occupied homes and then convert that to apartments. But if we're taking down a bunch of converted houses and turning that into, still apartments, but something that better fits into the neighborhood, then that incentive might be something you'd want to consider. I think in the downtown, and after this slide, I want to just talk about a little bit about some research on rents that I found. So the downtown housing pilot would be, we've done 7 in the last 5 years. Again, no real change in this policy other than, we would consider longer exemptions for affordable housing. Right now, we'd go up to 15 years. Maybe we should go up to 20. Maybe it should be a higher percentage if there's affordable housing units. But again, we think we need to, kind of study, that housing. I think this is something that's pretty interesting as far as what rents are like in Fargo compared to other cities and bordering states. And it doesn't surprise me that Fargo's had a very competitive housing market. We've had a little bit higher vacancy rates. It's been probably a little easier to develop housing in Fargo in terms of the zoning rules and land costs and the demographics. Has always been kind of driven that demand for apartments. But what you can see is that the median price of a 2-bedroom household or apartment in Fargo is $858, and this is as of last month's data, where if you look at Twin Cities suburbs or even other cities in North Dakota, it's higher. And I think this would be important to consider when we're deciding, well, what kind of housing are we trying to achieve? A lot of Twin Cities suburbs that have inclusionary policies are trying to create apartments that'll rent for $900 a month. But in Fargo, that's quite common to be in that range. But it also depends on your income and the demographics of the demand. But I thought this was interesting. The other thing that we're kind of an outlier in that in the last year, as more people have gotten back to work with COVID and people have been able to get their rent paid, some of these areas you've seen double-digit increases on apartment rent. In Montana up 20-some%, Wisconsin, Madison's up 7%. So we have not seen this kind of inflation in rents in Fargo. If you're a landlord, this is probably a disappointing table to look at. You're not seeing the rent growth that you see in other markets. But I think these are all things to consider when we're trying to figure out, well, what's the need for housing? Because if the median is 858, do we need a lot more apartments at that level or below that level based on people's incomes? So,
Jim, is that year-to-year rental growth the number of units or the cost of renting?
The cost of renting. So the cost from October of 2020 to cost in October 2021.
So there's places with 27% cost increase in rent?
Yeah, and that's what you're seeing with the inflationary pressures now, is that a lot of that is housing costs. And again, we're in a really competitive market. And so, I know we'd like to boost home ownership, but if we say, well, the best way to boost home ownership is to not allow any more apartments, that's going to reduce supply and increase costs.
I suppose there's an argument too, the more vacancies you have, the lower the costs will be also. So I mean, it's been suggested to me, don't stop us from building too much because that is your future for affordability also. So there's that balance, I'm guessing, of how much you build and when and who.
Yeah, someone trying to save for a down payment for a house, they're gonna be able to save quicker if they're paying $850 a month versus $1,400. So, yeah, lower rents can help people kind of build some equity for purchasing a home.
Commissioner Preston?
Jim, do you have a similar table for home pricing, house pricing?
No, the website I was on was on, but we can look for that kind of
That would be
data.
pretty telling, actually, yeah.
I think what I've seen in the past is that our cost of purchasing a home is probably closer to maybe the Minneapolis market, where here the rents are substantially lower.
So that's the other side of the equation.
Yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, I think the challenge of providing, houses that are affordable, but then also getting the wages up because, if you can get the wages up, then you can afford the house prices. So.
Yep.
Moving on to tax increment financing, we've got we've done 4 projects in the last year. Generally, this is helping redevelopment in older areas. I've defined the brownfield is defined in the policy. It's a site that has some sort of perceived or real contamination or rubble that would have to be removed. The slum and blight is from the North Dakota Century Code definition. The main change, and this is one that you had approved several months ago, is that when someone's requesting a brownfield, they would first go to the Tax Exempt Review Committee. We'd work on it, and then there would just be one stop at City Commission to decide whether or not to approve that versus having to come to you twice. This is a lot more focused on brownfield and difficult to develop sites. For instance, the site up on CAS 20, where we had a request for a TIF, you had denied that, and I think you've been pointed out that one would probably develop anyway. And so it really, they need to prove some brownfield before they're going to qualify versus a greenfield. And so I think this provides direction to potential developers on what you'll actually consider, and that we probably won't consider any greenfield sites. So try to make that clear. The public-private partnerships.
Actually, on
Commissioner Gary?
TIFs, a couple of things. One, I really don't like this idea of cost of acquisition. So we can do a TIF for a property based on what they paid for the property. If you overpaid for the property, you overpaid for the property. That's not the taxpayer's fault. So I'd really like to see that gone out of this. Secondly, I'd like to see much more specific of what the TIF money is being used for. Right now, we drew a box around downtown, and we're taking all the money as a city, and we're just putting it in a pot of money on whatever we want to spend it on inside that box. That's what Bismarck did for decades, and that's not what we're doing.
And I think what we're doing, though, on the Riverfront TIF plan, we have a larger area. The others are quite site-specific.
I agree, but I don't want to do that again. I think we should get rid of that idea altogether. That should never have happened, and it should never happen in the future, where we just draw a multi-citywide block around and say, well, that money's ours now, and the schools and the parks and those guys don't get anything above and beyond the current value for the next 20, 40 years. So if we're going to give a TIF, it should be for this reason. It should be, we're taking this money to pay for this, and when that's paid for, then the TIF is gone. We're not doing that currently, and I think that should be way more specific in this policy.
In this particular, in the P3, we would be potentially doing what you're suggesting. In this policy, we would be for that specific project. So generally it's land acquisition, demolition, public facilities. Those are kind of the 3 areas that are the extraordinary costs to kind of get it to be more of a greenfield type site. And in the downtown, we've had ones where we've created the TIF and then used the city money for the parking ramp.
The part that worries me is in here it says public works or improvements necessary to carry out the development or renewal plan. A renewal plan can be a decades-long plan. So we have a TIF for decades to address that renewal plan. It shouldn't be that way. It should be, we are taking a TIF to clear off this property, or we're taking a TIF to put in a road, or something like that. It should never be for a renewal plan that it might be 40 years long. That's not the reason we give incentives.
Well, there's two different types of renewal plans. One is, for instance, with Drecker, there's a contaminated site and some utility issues, and we're providing money just for these specific activities. We really don't use it outside the box, and it's a relatively small box. The other is a riverfront TIF, where we go and run from, 6th Avenue South to, 3rd Avenue or 5th Avenue North, 4th Street, very large area, wide range of activities. And so there are two different types. And so this policy is aimed more at the small box, and the P3 is aimed at when we're doing a big box or big area. And whatever you put in your renewal plan that you're going to spend money on, that's what you can do. If you don't put it in the plan, you can't do it. If you put it in the plan, there's quite a bit of range of activities you can accomplish within that district. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
I'll listen to the next slide and see what that says.
So the P3, these would go to the city commission on a recommendation from the tax exempt committee. These involve these larger area plans like the riverfront or Block 9 or Mercantile, and they take quite a bit of time to put together. And so really we want to get the initial approval of the city commission to even develop the plan, because it is relatively time consuming. And then the plan must include some type of public facilities, public activities. So it goes beyond just developer assistance. The plan would have to be consistent with other city plans and provide a community benefit. And then also the public assistance must be essential for any development to occur. So I'll use the Anderson Field example. That's one that you didn't approve. It could have been in P3, but clearly that's developing without any type of TIF funds. So any comments or thoughts on this? Probably won't have a lot of these. The monitoring procedures and clawback provisions. The first two are unchanged. The city assessor determines you either remodel or you built new, or if you did, you get the incentive. The job creation projects, Ken Costin and Mike Pliskowski and Eric Johnson are working on a business incentive agreement that would be signed prior to the exemptions beginning. They'll be providing you with a report later this month on their progress on reviewing the past projects. So this requires those types of reporting. If they find through the reporting that the requirements have not been yet, you have a couple different options. One is, you could extend requirements for up to 2 years, so that if there was a recession in that particular industry or business, maybe you need to give them more time. Or you could enact the clawback provision requiring either some sort of repayment of the assistance that had been granted if they just didn't, move into the building like they thought.
Mr. Strand.
Jim, we don't currently, as I understand it, do this. So if we implement this new policy, would it look back to previous agreements, or would it be starting with a new start point where agreements from this point forward will have this requirement?
I think we're trying to sort that out. What we find is that I think about a third of the incentives do have agreements, business incentive agreements. I'm not sure what we've gotten reporting on all of those. The ones that we've done recently, we could require, not the attorney, but I'll make an opinion anyway. The state law requires us to have these business incentive agreements. So it seems like we could go to each of the businesses and say, hey, this was required by state law, either sign or you don't get your incentives.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Pipkin.
So real quick, Jim, the reporting part of it, we were going to work with the EDC to have kind of an efficient, are we still working on that? Has that been completed, or are we still working on that?
Yeah, Mike and Kent have been working on most. Maybe I'll ask Kent to give you an update on where he's at.
Yes, Commissioners, at this point, we have evaluated the Century Code. There are some provisions in the Century Code. It's a little more complicated because if you want to follow the Century Code, we get a sense that the Century Code provisions are much more lenient than what you're perhaps talking about. I'll give you an example, like the reporting requirements would be report on the goal of job creation for every year until you attain the goal, and after you attain the goal, boom, we're done. So if you do a 15-year exemption or a 10-year exemption and you meet the goal in year 2, then state law says, okay, done, close the file, you've complied. I'm not so sure. I mean, I think more discussion is going to be needed with you with regard to how we administer that. And then there's certain categorical types of projects that are totally excluded from the reporting requirements. So we're having to kind of sort out the state law a bit, and we're working with Eric Johnson on that. And what we would intend to bring back would be a draft of a business incentive agreement. It may turn out to be a hybrid of the state law and what we perceive your directives would be, and we probably would need to have that discussion at that time. So we haven't sent letters out yet because we're not sure exactly what we're asking them to do. We've spent most time evaluating the Century Code and discussing it with the city attorney.
Commissioner Preston.
So Kent, the reporting requirements in the Century Code, it's not a maximum, is it a minimum? And then we can go beyond that. Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, I think I know what you're saying. Yeah, if we did more than what they're requiring, I think that would be acceptable.
Okay.
Commissioner Pepcorn.
So, Mr. Chair, the one thing I want to make sure, see, I think the EDC has requirements for some of their programs, and I want to make sure that if they already have something that's existing, to make it as simple as possible. That's the main thing. And so have we had communication with the EDC, and can we work together to have it be as simple as possible? Because I think we're making it more complicated than it needs to be. If they promise to have this many jobs at this pay, that's all we want to know. And for this many years, and so I don't know if that makes, it just seems like we're making it more complicated. So can you talk about that, Kent?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in your policy development, if we can obtain that information from somebody else that's certified it and gone through that process, I think that would be fine. It would take some coordination, obviously, with that other agency, just like what we're going to do with the low-income housing type. We're going to rely on the staff and the people of the state. Again, the coordination and the integration of the provisions of the state law would be important to clearly understand what they're requiring, and if you want to depart, then we need to define that departure and put it into writing.
Mr. Chair, just real quick, but so the EDC is under the same state regulations that we are. And so I think that they are already doing a lot of things, and it's redundancy that hopefully we can just copy. Do you get what I'm saying? So if we can do that, and maybe Jim, you can work with the EDC and do that, I'd appreciate it, because I just think that would save us a whole lot of, by communicating now, it would save us a lot of extra work at the end. Thank you.
Commissioner Preston.
And in the spirit of transparency, that gets reported to us like on an annual basis of some sorts?
I think just as far as EDC, they have this growth initiative fund, and so if people are also using that program, then they're going to have some reports. If they're not using that program, then they're probably not receiving any reporting. But I think it's important to work with EDC because they're doing kind of follow-up visits with these primary sector companies anyway, and so the more that we can coordinate the monitoring, the better. Let's see, as far as the other ones are relatively, they're actually not required, as Kent noted, if you're at all doing housing in your project, you're not covered by that state law. That monitoring is up to the cities. With the pilots, the planning pilots and TIFs, the planning department has been verifying costs and verifying compliance and then reporting that to the city assessor. And then as long as there's the same owner, the city assessor continues to provide that exemption. When there's a TIF note, that's gonna, again, the city assessor reports what's to the county, what's in the TIF district. The money's paid to the finance office, and then the finance office provides it to the developer for the agreement. One final thing we get toward the end here is that just the committee name and makeup. We're looking at recommending change the name to the Economic Development Incentives Committee or some sort of Economic Development Committee, just because when this committee was first formed, it was strictly, job creation and the tax exempt thing, and it's gotten a little broader with housing and that, and so recommending that name change. Also, kind of following what was done with Liquor Control Committee, is to change the voting members of the committee to have that the two department, or the city administrator and finance director would continue to be advisory members, but would not be voting members. And then you would appoint two other citizen members as voting members. The school districts would continue to be ex officio members, as well as Cass County, because they're also, Cass County is reviewing these when they go beyond 5 years. So, but there'll still be the same advisory members that we've had before. Myself and others would continue to be advisory members. So that'd be the other, change in terms of the name of the committee and who are the appointees, to try to get more community members involved in the review of these applications.
Who would appoint the two members?
The city commission.
Thank you.
Is what I'll follow up. I can put this on your agenda for action in 2 weeks if you think it's ready for that. I think I'll go back and look at that scoring system a little bit, adjust those wages, and other than that, I'm not hearing any specific changes, other than I think we'll certainly do a good job in monitoring these.
Any questions of the commission?
Mr. Chairman, the only other thing I would suggest is that right in the policy, you include an annual report to the city commission on the monitoring process.
Okay.
Mr. Strand?
Thank you. Initially, Jim, this is terrific. The feedback, the incorporation of the suggestions from commissioners, at least from my perspective, is really substantial, and you listened, and your team listened, and I want to thank you for that. And I'm pleasantly surprised that we're really revising all of this and reinventing. One of the topics that's not a big deal that surfaced is the notion of, if somebody's coming forward with requests to do projects, I'd like us to still know if there's any way we can incent architectural or artful enhancements to their physical properties. So if somebody's got a project, fine, but if they got a project, they're gonna make it look spectacular, and they're gonna make it a showpiece for the community and for, almost public art type things. I'd be curious if there's any way we can incent enhancements to design so that it's for the visual greater good of the community. The other topic I'm not sure I'm seeing here, but maybe it's just
Just
me.
on that, John, how many points would you give?
I don't know.
Let's say there's 100 points to make it. Would you give them 10 if they did art to it?
I'd like to know, I don't know. I'd just like to have a discussion about.
But think about that. So if you think we have a project going on Main, they're going to put art to it. If you think you gave them 10 points to it, say they came in at 90, we'd normally like to give them 100. And if they put art to it, they might get 10 points for that. I want you to just think about the point on the wage scale issue, since that's worth 75. What do you think it would be to add art? So,
And I'm open to having that discussion. What I'm not really sure I'm clear on in this approach is the notion of, for example, the Roosevelt neighborhood. And I'd like to have us encapsulate out what's it look like for the Roosevelt neighborhood. So I understand in consolidate all of these combined incentives and programs, what's that mean for Roosevelt, for example? Or can we step that up for that at-risk neighborhood? If I can get a better understanding of that, for my sake, that would help me.
Just note on the, the public art and design, that is sort of built into one of the criteria for the brownfield, but perhaps it should be for the core neighborhood and the downtown housing that's kind of built into because of the zoning downtown requires certain design standards, but we could certainly look at that for the core neighborhood. I think the whole core neighborhood plan redevelopment, this can be a small component of it, but what we do with trying to promote home ownership, code enforcement, encouraging some infill housing, kind of goes beyond what this policy is and rests a little bit more with the planning department and the community development committee.
Mr. Pipcorn.
This is a great report. Thank you, Jim, for all you've done. And I'm very excited we're having this evaluation done of our economic incentives, and I do think that will work with this. I'm looking forward to seeing what an outside group's perspective is on what we're doing now. I think that's going to be another good part of this, that I think that will add to I just think having an outside view is always a good thing. And getting to John's question, we do have these neighborhoods now that we know we need to help, that need extra help. And to me, the tax exempt is just a part of it. I think there's other things that we as the city commission have to commit to, because especially it's like now we know which neighborhoods need the most help, and so we need to do something about that. And so I think this is just part of that. Thank you, and once again thank the staff, and I thought it was really good, and we tried to incorporate everybody's ideas, and it's obviously an ongoing thing, and so I don't believe we're ever going to be finished, even though there's a deadline on it. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Preston.
Yeah, so there will be another housing rehab program that hopefully will be up and running in this next year that will actually do a cash inflow into those neighborhoods. It's not a tax exemption issue, but it's a actual cash kind of help.
Mr. Strand.
Thank you. I'm just curious, and I don't know how it fits into this, but in the lane of discussing affordable housing and incentives, there are some affordable housing people or developers that conceivably their projects in 15, 20, 25, 30 years can become market rate of housing. Do we accommodate that, or does it matter to us right now if we're incenting affordable housing, but a generation or two later, it's allowed to and maybe does shift to market rate housing?
The North Dakota Housing Finance Agency generally puts a 30-year term on when it has to be affordable. That goes beyond the federal requirement is 15 years. And so yeah, after 15 years, then that low-income housing could become market rate housing, depending on who owns it. For instance, the housing authority, if they're required to do it for 30 years, well, they're going to own it to probably, we'll keep it that way in perpetuity or as long as it's feasible. So sometimes it's really important to look at who's the developer and what's their long-term plan. Is it a low-income nonprofit that intends to hold this beyond the 30 years, or is it more of a private for-profit developer who, into their pro forma, is they do plan to sell it at the end of 30 years. At the end of 30 years, generally the building's going to need some type of renovation.
Any other questions? Good work, Mike, good work. You guys have worked at this quite hard, and it looks like you came up with a good report. We'll look forward to it on the commission in 2 weeks. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you later today. Thank you.